For 14 years, the death of 12-year-old Kevin Miller was a settled tragedy in Lake Oswego, Oregon, officially ruled a suicide that left his family adrift in a sea of unanswered questions. But when a former classmate's scrapbook surfaced from a forgotten box, its pages held a chilling secret: unpublished photos from the death scene, proof that someone else was there. This single, accidental discovery would unravel a decade-long lie, forcing police to re-examine every fact and revealing a story of childhood cruelty far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. In the fall of 2011, the city of Lake Oswego, Oregon, was a portrait of autumnal perfection, its manicured lawns blanketed in the fiery reds and golds of maple leaves. Within this idyllic Portland suburb, the Miller family lived a life of comfortable routine, anchored by their 2 children. Sarah, a sharp and protective 16-year-old, was already charting a course for college, while her brother, 12-year-old Kevin Miller, navigated the complex world of middle school with a quiet imagination that served as both his shield and his sanctuary. Kevin was a boy of intricate worlds, a creator who spent hours at his desk filling sketchbooks with fantastical heroes and monstrous villains, his characters locked in epic battles he charted with meticulous care. Kevin's passions were not confined to paper. He loved the dense, mossy forests that fringed the town, often exploring the trails around Tryon Creek with his small circle of friends. He was looking forward to his 13th birthday, a milestone that felt impossibly grown-up and which he had been planning for months. He had requested a specific, expensive graphic design tablet, a tool he believed would transform his hand-drawn comics into professional-looking digital creations. To his family, and especially to Sarah, Kevin was not a troubled child, but a gentle soul on the cusp of his own becoming, his future as bright and promising as the crisp October sky. On the afternoon of October 26th, Sarah returned home from high school to an unusually silent house, the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. Their parents were still at work, and Kevin's backpack was dropped by the door, but he didn't answer when she called his name through the echoing rooms. A flicker of annoyance turned to a nod of unease as she checked his bedroom, finding his latest comic book lying open on his unmade bed, a silent testament to an interrupted afternoon. She called his name again, her voice now laced with an urgency she couldn't explain, the silence of the house pressing in around her. It was a strange, instinctual dread that led her to the basement door, a place Kevin rarely went, preferring the light of his own room. The air that rose to meet her as she opened it was cold and carried the familiar, damp scent of concrete and old storage boxes. She descended the wooden stairs, her footsteps swallowed by the oppressive quiet, and called his name one last time, the sound dying in her throat as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. In the far corner of the unfinished space, illuminated by a single bare bulb, she saw him and the world fractured into a million unrecognizable pieces. The minutes that followed were a blur of primal sound and disjointed motion, a memory that would forever be seared into Sarah's mind, not as a sequence of events, but as a collage of sensory horror. She remembered the guttural scream that was ripped from her own lungs, a sound she didn't recognize as her own, and the frantic, clumsy fumbling with her phone as she dialed for help. Then came the wail of sirens, growing from a distant cry to an overwhelming roar that filled their quiet street, followed by the disorienting arrival of paramedics and police officers whose faces were a mixture of grim professionalism and pity. They moved with a purpose that felt alien in the sacred space of her home, their presence transforming a family sanctuary into a sterile, official crime scene. The initial narrative began to form almost immediately, spoken in hushed, authoritative tones that Sarah could only partially comprehend through her shock. An officer with weary eyes gently guided her upstairs, away from the basement, while others secured the area with yellow tape that seemed to scream its violation against the familiar backdrop of their lives. The words "no signs of forced entry" and "no note, but it's common" drifted through the chaos, laying the foundation for a conclusion that seemed to be reached before the investigation had truly begun. They were seeing the scene through a particular lens, one shaped by statistical probabilities and the heartbreaking frequency of adolescent despair. In that sterile, procedural assessment, the boy Sarah knew was already beginning to vanish, replaced by a tragic archetype. The vibrant, creative child who loved comics and forest trails was being reframed as a victim of unseen demons, a secret sorrow that had festered beneath the surface of their happy family. The questions the authorities asked were not about who could have done this, but about what could have driven him to it. Had he been bullied? Was he depressed? Were there problems at home? Each question was a small, sharp blow, layering a foundation of guilt and confusion on top of the family's immeasurable grief. For Sarah, kneeling on the living room rug as the house filled with strangers, the dissonance was immediate and absolute. The boy they were describing was not her brother. The story they were constructing did not fit the reality she knew. She thought of his excitement over his birthday, the half-finished drawing on his desk, the way he'd argued with her just that morning over who got the last of the cereal. These were the details of a life being lived, not one being abandoned, and in the heart of her trauma, a single defiant thought took root. It was a seed of doubt, a rejection of the easy, terrible answer that was settling over their home like a shroud. The first responders, trained to manage trauma, saw a family reeling from the unthinkable and interpreted their shock and disbelief as a natural stage of grief. The scene in the basement, to their experienced eyes, told a straightforward, if heartbreaking, story. A common household item had been used, the location was secluded, and there were no immediate, obvious signs of a physical struggle or the presence of another person. The absence of a note was explained away as typical for impulsive acts, a detail that, while painful for the family, did not contradict the emerging theory of the case. The Lake Oswego Police Department, a small force accustomed to dealing with property crimes and traffic violations, was not equipped for the nuance of a potential juvenile homicide masquerading as a suicide. The lead detective assigned to the case, a man nearing retirement, approached the scene with a paternal sorrow. He saw a tragedy that mirrored others he had witnessed over a long career, and confirmation bias began to subtly shape the collection and interpretation of evidence. The investigation became less about discovering what had happened and more about confirming the initial devastating assumption. That night, when their parents finally arrived home, their world collapsed in the sterile blue and red glow of the emergency lights. They were escorted into their own home, now a place of horror, and given the news in the muted, practiced tones of professional grief deliverers. The official story was already solidifying, becoming a fact that they were expected to accept. Kevin, their bright and loving son, had taken his own life, and the focus was now on the unanswerable question of why. Sarah, however, held on to the image of her brother's scuffed new sneakers, a detail that seemed trivial to everyone else but screamed at her. He had been so proud of them, meticulously cleaning them after every wear, yet they were marked with dirt and a long, dark scuff along the side, as if he had been dragged. When she tried to mention this to the detective, he had patted her arm, his expression full of sympathy for a sister searching for any explanation other than the terrible truth. Her observation was noted but dismissed as inconsequential, a footnote in the growing file of a case that was already considered closed in spirit if not in practice. The official story was being written, and it did not have room for a grieving sister's discordant memories or a pair of scuffed shoes. The investigation into Kevin Miller's death, conducted in the fall of 2011, was a study in procedural efficiency and tragic assumption. From the moment authorities first surveyed the basement scene, they operated under the prevailing theory of suicide, a conclusion that colored every subsequent action and observation in law enforcement. Particularly in cases involving adolescents, this framework is a common starting point, designed to approach a grieving family with sensitivity. But it can also act as a powerful form of tunnel vision, causing investigators to seek evidence that confirms their initial belief while unintentionally overlooking details that might contradict it. The scene itself, when viewed through this lens, appeared tragically unambiguous. Kevin was found in a remote corner of the unfinished basement, a space cluttered with holiday decorations and forgotten furniture, lending it an air of isolation. The ligature used was a simple rope, easily accessible within the home, and the knot was one that a 12-year-old could conceivably tie. The official report noted the absence of any defensive wounds on Kevin's hands or arms and the lack of any signs of a significant struggle in the surrounding area, with no overturned furniture or scattered objects to suggest a fight had taken place. The initial police canvass of the neighborhood yielded nothing of substance. Neighbors reported seeing nothing unusual that afternoon. No strange vehicles, no unfamiliar individuals coming or going from the Miller home. Kevin's friends were interviewed, their tearful conversations guided by a school counselor and a detective. They spoke of typical middle school anxieties, grades, friendships, the low-grade social pressures of being 12, but none could point to a specific event or a deep-seated depression that would foreshadow such an act. Their confusion was interpreted by investigators not as a sign that something was amiss, but as proof of how well Kevin had hidden his internal turmoil. Inside the Miller home, the process continued with a somber, methodical pace. Crime scene technicians photographed the basement from every angle, their flashes illuminating the cold concrete walls and dusty floorboards. They collected the rope for analysis and dusted for fingerprints on the nearby wooden support beam, but the results would later show only smudged, unidentifiable prints and those belonging to the Miller family. The house was not treated as a potential homicide scene, therefore the scope of the forensic search was limited, focusing primarily on the immediate area where Kevin's body was found, rather than a full-scale examination of every room, window, and entry point. The medical examiner's role was to provide the definitive scientific conclusion. The autopsy was performed the following day, a clinical procedure designed to uncover the physiological cause of death. The findings confirmed asphyxiation as the cause, consistent with hanging. The report meticulously documented the ligature marks on Kevin's neck, but noted the absence of other significant injuries, reinforcing the police theory of a non-violent, self-inflicted act. The detail Sarah had noticed, the scuff marks on his new shoes, was not considered relevant to the cause of death and was therefore omitted from the final coroner's report, a microscopic piece of data lost in the machinery of a routine investigation. The coroner's ruling is the final authoritative word in any death investigation, carrying immense legal and emotional weight. In Kevin's case, the ruling came swiftly: suicide. With that single word, the case was officially closed. The thick manila folder containing the crime scene photos, witness statements, and autopsy report was stamped, filed, and relegated to the archives of the Lake Oswego Police Department. For the system, the book was shut. A tragedy had occurred, it had been processed according to protocol, and the community could now begin the long, sad process of mourning and moving on. Just days after the funeral, a police officer delivered several cardboard boxes to the Miller home. They contained the last of Kevin's possessions, the clothes he had been wearing, his backpack, and the contents of his school locker. The return of these items is a standard final step in a closed case, a gesture meant to provide a sense of finality for the grieving family. For the Millers, however, it felt like being handed a box of evidence from a crime no one believed had happened, each object a painful reminder of the life that had been stolen and the questions that had been dismissed. Sarah's father, a quiet, stoic man, retreated into a shell of grief, unable to speak of Kevin without his voice breaking. Her mother oscillated between profound sorrow and flashes of anger at a world that could allow such a thing to happen, directing her anguish inward. It was Sarah who found herself poring over the contents of the boxes, searching for something, anything that would validate the gnawing doubt that had taken root in her soul. She examined the scuffed shoes again. The dark streak, a tangible piece of wrongness in a narrative that felt so profoundly untrue. She also found the comic book from his desk, the one he had been working on when he died. On the last page he'd drawn, a superhero stood cornered by a shadowy villain, the panel unfinished, the hero's fate left hanging in the balance. To Sarah, it was a metaphor for Kevin himself, a story that had been cut short, not concluded. This book, along with the image of the scuffed shoes, became her own private pieces of evidence, talismans of her disbelief against the crushing weight of the official conclusion. The family was now truly alone, with its grief isolated by a verdict that felt like a betrayal. The community wrapped them in a blanket of sympathy, but it was a sympathy predicated on the acceptance of Kevin's suicide. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered whispered condolences that spoke of the hidden darkness in children, the secrets they keep from their own parents. These well-meaning gestures only deepened the Millers' sense of isolation, forcing them to perform a version of grief that aligned with the public narrative, while their private reality was one of confusion, doubt, and a growing sense of injustice. The investigative file on Kevin Miller gathered dust on a shelf, a ghost haunting the archives. The lead detective retired a few years later, his career capped with a sad, settled memory of the Miller boys' tragedy. The case faded from local headlines, replaced by the mundane rhythm of municipal life, and Kevin's story became a cautionary tale whispered among parents at PTA meetings. It was a local tragedy, sharp and terrible at the time, but one that was now neatly categorized and filed away, its complexities smoothed over by the passage of time and the finality of an official report. The system had worked as designed. A death was reported, an investigation was conducted, a cause was determined, and a case was closed. But in its methodical efficiency, it had failed to account for the most human of elements, a sister's intuition, and the subtle, discordant details that suggested a far more sinister truth. The official story, etched in police reports and a coroner's certificate, was now the only one that mattered, leaving the Miller family to navigate their grief under the shadow of a lie. In the months following the closing of Kevin's case, the Miller house became a museum of grief, each room preserving a silence that felt heavier than air. The official ruling of suicide had descended upon the family not as a resolution but as a second, more insidious trauma. It forced them to question their own memories, to scrutinize every past interaction with Kevin for a sign they might have missed. This search for a hidden meaning, for a clue that would make sense of the official narrative, was an agonizing exercise in futility because at their core they did not believe the narrative was true. The family's doubt was not a vague, emotional reaction born of denial. It was anchored to specific, tangible inconsistencies. For Sarah, it was the scuffed sneakers, a detail she could not mentally reconcile. Kevin had saved for 2 months to buy those shoes and treated them like sacred objects. The idea that he would have been so careless with them in his final moments felt fundamentally wrong. For her mother, it was the absence of a note, which felt deeply out of character for her thoughtful, expressive son who processed the world through writing and drawing. He was a boy who communicated, and the notion that he would depart with such silence felt like a violation of his very nature. Their most persistent and haunting doubt, however, was rooted in a memory from the week before Kevin died. He had come home from school, visibly upset, his usual quietness replaced by a tense, nervous energy. He'd been vague about the cause, mumbling something about a disagreement with a friend named Mark Bishop, but had brushed off his parents' concerns, insisting it was stupid kid stuff. At the time, it seemed like a minor, fleeting adolescent conflict, but in the horrifying aftermath of his death, the memory took on a sinister new weight. Armed with these fragments of doubt, the shoes, the missing note, the memory of the argument, the Millers attempted to re-engage with the authorities. Sarah's father scheduled a meeting with the lead detective, hoping that in the calm light of day, removed from the initial chaos, their concerns would be heard. They laid out their reasons for disbelief, presenting their image of Kevin not as grieving parents in denial, but as the world's foremost experts on their own child. They spoke of his plans for the future, his happy disposition, and the strange, unresolved conflict with his classmate. The detective listened with a practiced patience, his expression a mask of professional empathy. He reviewed his notes, nodded thoughtfully, but his response was a gentle yet firm deflection. He explained that adolescent emotions are volatile and that even the happiest-seeming children can hide deep wells of pain. The argument with a friend, he suggested, could have been the very trigger that pushed Kevin over the edge, a final straw in a struggle no one else could see. Each of their points was met with a counter-explanation that neatly fit the established suicide narrative, turning their evidence of life into proof of a secret despair. Their concerns were framed as a natural, understandable part of the grieving process. The detective's kindness was in its own way a form of dismissal, a quiet insistence that they accept the reality that had been handed to them. They left the police station not with a sense of hope, but with a profound feeling of powerlessness. They were civilians questioning a closed case, amateurs challenging the conclusions of professionals. The system that was supposed to provide answers had instead built a wall around a single, unchangeable verdict, leaving them on the outside with their unanswered questions. This rejection by the authorities marked a turning point for the family, pushing them further into a painful isolation. They could no longer speak openly of their doubts without sounding like they were lost in denial or, worse, spiraling into conspiracy. Friends and neighbors, who had once been a source of support, now offered pitying looks, their conversations tiptoeing around the forbidden subject of Kevin's death. The official story had become the only socially acceptable one, and the Millers' refusal to embrace it marked them as a family stuck in an unhealthy stage of grief. The community's narrative began to curdle into something crueler. In the absence of a clear motive for suicide, gossip and speculation filled the void. Rumors of hidden family strife or deep-seated psychological issues began to circulate, quiet whispers in grocery store aisles and at school pickup lines. The Millers were not only grieving their son and the injustice of his unsolved death, but they were also forced to endure the silent judgment of a community that had accepted the easiest, most convenient explanation. They were victims of a crime they couldn't prove, and now they were becoming pariahs in their own town. For Sarah, this powerlessness was a formative fire. The experience of being dismissed by the very people meant to protect and serve ignited in her a cold, determined anger. She watched her parents retreat into their sorrow and saw how the official narrative had effectively silenced them, leaving them without recourse or a voice. It was in those months of frustration and helplessness that she made a decision that would define the rest of her life. She would become a lawyer. Her ambition was not born of a lofty ideal of justice, but from a raw personal need to understand the language of power, to learn how to navigate the systems that had so thoroughly failed her family. She threw herself into her studies with a ferocious intensity, her grief sublimated into a drive for academic excellence. She saw every textbook, every case study as a weapon she was forging for a future battle. Her goal was clear and unwavering. One day she would have the knowledge, the credentials, and the authority to force the world to look at Kevin's case again. She would not be a grieving teenager to be patted on the head and sent away. She would be an officer of the court, armed with facts and jurisprudence, and she would demand the truth that had been denied to them. The Miller family learned to live a fractured existence, presenting a facade of healing to the outside world while privately nurturing their lingering doubts. They stopped talking about Kevin's death with others, and eventually, even among themselves, the topic became a painful, silent presence at the dinner table. The scuffed sneakers were wrapped in cloth and placed in a box in Sarah's closet, a sacred relic of her private investigation. The unfinished comic book was stored alongside them, a promise of a story that she and she alone was now responsible for finishing. Their doubt became a quiet, secret faith, a belief in their son that they held against the judgment of the entire world. The 14 years that followed the closing of Kevin Miller's case were a testament to the slow, grinding power of time to bury a tragedy under layers of new life. In Lake Oswego, the world moved on with an unthinking momentum. New families moved into the neighborhood, their children playing in the same parks where Kevin had once explored, oblivious to the history that lingered in the soil. The middle school he attended was renovated, its old hallways and lockers replaced, erasing the physical spaces that had once held his presence. For the community, the Miller tragedy became a faded memory, a sad story from long ago that had lost its sharp edges. For the Miller family, however, time did not heal. It merely stretched their grief into a new permanent shape. They learned to live around the hollow space Kevin had left behind, a process of accommodation rather than recovery. His bedroom door remained closed, a silent monument to a life interrupted, its contents untouched as if he might one day walk back in to claim them. Holidays were the hardest, each celebration a painful reminder of the person who was missing from the table, his absence a palpable presence in the room. They developed a quiet, resilient sorrow, a grief that was woven so deeply into the fabric of their lives that it became a part of who they were. Sarah's father channeled his pain into his work, taking on extra hours and burying himself in projects, finding a strange comfort in the solvable problems of his profession. Her mother dedicated herself to volunteer work, a quiet penance for a failure she couldn't name but felt in her bones. They grew older, the lines on their faces deepening, their movements slower as if weighed down by an invisible burden. They rarely spoke of Kevin's death, the subject sealed away like a toxic substance that was too dangerous to handle, yet its radioactive presence was felt in every corner of their home. True to her vow, Sarah pursued her ambition with relentless focus. She excelled in her studies, leaving Oregon for college and then for law school on the East Coast, creating a physical distance that did little to quell the emotional fire that drove her. She specialized in criminal law, not as a prosecutor or a defense attorney, but in the more academic realm of wrongful convictions, drawn to stories that mirrored her own family's experience. She studied cases where official narratives had crumbled under the weight of new evidence, where science had exposed the flaws in human judgment and confirmation bias. Her career became her crusade, an indirect way of continuing the investigation that the police had abandoned. She was respected by her colleagues for her sharp mind and her tireless work ethic, but she held a part of herself back, a private core of motivation that no one could fully understand. She never told them the full story of her brother. It was a private grief, the engine that powered her professional life. In her work, she found a sense of purpose, a way to fight for others who, like her family, had been silenced by the certainty of a flawed system. Years passed. Sarah established a successful career as an appellate lawyer, her life becoming a testament to the future Kevin never had. She would sometimes return to Lake Oswego to visit her aging parents, the trips filled with a bittersweet nostalgia. Driving through the familiar streets, she would see ghosts of her childhood on every corner. The park where she pushed Kevin on the swings, the convenience store where they bought candy, the winding road to their old house. The town was the same, yet irrevocably different, haunted by the memory of what had been lost there. The official story of Kevin's suicide had, over the course of 14 years, hardened into an immutable fact, a piece of local history. The few people who still remembered the case thought of it only in the terms that had been established back in 2011. The narrative of a sad, troubled boy who had succumbed to a secret despair was the only one that remained. The family's initial doubts were long forgotten by the public, dismissed as the early frantic protestations of grief. The silence surrounding the case was now absolute, the file buried deep within the police archives, a closed chapter in every sense of the word. For the Miller family, living with the official narrative was a quiet, ongoing torment. It was a story that erased the boy they knew and loved, replacing him with a stranger. They were forced to carry not only the weight of his death, but also the weight of a public misconception that they were powerless to correct. It was a profound and lonely burden, a secret descent they maintained in a world that had moved on. The truth, as they knew it, existed only within the walls of their home and in the deepest chambers of their hearts. The 14 years of silence were not empty. They were filled with the phantom ache of injustice. Sarah, now a formidable lawyer in her late 20s, had never abandoned her private vow. She had simply been waiting, gathering her strength and her knowledge, for a moment, a sign, a crack in the wall of silence. She didn't know what it would be or when it would come, but she held on to a sliver of hope that one day something would shift. She believed that a truth as profound as murder could not stay buried forever, that eventually the earth itself would conspire to push it back into the light, and so she waited, her vigil quiet and patient, through 14 long years of unrelenting silence. In the late summer of 2025, 14 years after Kevin Miller's death, the past broke through the surface of the present in the most mundane of places, a dusty, forgotten storage unit in an industrial park on the outskirts of Portland. The unit had been rented by Mark Bishop years ago and subsequently abandoned, its contents destined for auction. Before that could happen, the facility manager allowed his ex-girlfriend, a woman named Chloe, to retrieve a few personal items she had stored there, a final messy act of untangling their shared history. Chloe, a graphic designer in her early 30s, navigated the cluttered space with a sense of weary obligation, sorting through old furniture and boxes of junk. Tucked away in the back corner was a large plastic bin labeled college stuff, and inside, beneath a stack of faded textbooks and old band t-shirts, she found a thick, black scrapbook. It was heavy and crudely made, its cover adorned with cut-out letters from magazines that spelled out the single cryptic word, secrets. Her curiosity piqued. She sat on a dusty armchair and opened it. The first few pages were filled with typical adolescent artifacts, ticket stubs from movies, photos of teenagers making faces at the camera, inside jokes scrawled in silver marker. It seemed like a normal, if slightly angsty, time capsule from Mark's middle school years. But as she turned the pages, the tone of the scrapbook began to shift, growing darker and more unsettling. The photos became more voyeuristic, the captions more cryptic. It felt less like a collection of memories and more like a catalog of transgressions. Then she turned a page and her breath caught in her chest. Glued to the black construction paper were a series of candid, full-color photographs that were instantly, horribly recognizable. They depicted the interior of a dim, unfinished basement, and in the center of the frame was the unmistakable image of a young boy hanging from a rope. The photos were taken from different angles, some up close, some from a distance, documenting the scene with a chilling, detached precision. They were not the sterile black and white crime scene photos of a police file. They were intimate, personal, and undeniably taken by someone who was present at the moment of death. Chloe felt a wave of nausea. She had grown up in the Portland area and had a vague, residual memory of the Miller case, a local tragedy about a boy who had taken his own life. The scrapbook, with its taunting title and its horrific contents, told a different story. It was not a memorial. It was a trophy. Below the photos, a single sentence was written in the same silver marker: "Some secrets you take to the grave, some you don't." The implication was terrifyingly clear. This was not the chronicle of a suicide. It was the evidence of a murder hidden in plain sight for over a decade. For several days, Chloe was paralyzed by indecision. The scrapbook, a toxic object sitting on her kitchen table. She didn't know what to do. Taking it to the police felt overwhelming and surreal. Confronting Mark, whom she hadn't spoken to in years, felt dangerous. She searched his name online and found that he was living a quiet, unremarkable life in another state, a successful architect with a wife and children. The disconnect between the man he appeared to be and the monster who could have created this book was a chasm she couldn't bridge. Finally, driven by a sense of profound moral duty, she began her own quiet investigation. She searched online for news articles about the Kevin Miller case from 2011. She found the archived stories from local papers, all reporting the official ruling of suicide. She also found a more recent article from a legal journal about wrongful convictions, and her eyes widened as she saw the author's name, Sarah Miller. The article included a brief biography, identifying her as a lawyer and the sister of the late Kevin Miller. With trembling hands, Chloe composed an email. She kept it brief and to the point, stating that she had come into possession of some information related to her brother's death that she believed law enforcement needed to see. She left her phone number and hit send, her heart pounding in her chest. She had no idea if the email would ever be read or if she had just invited a world of trouble into her life. But she knew she could not be the next person to keep this terrible secret. She had stumbled upon a ghost, and it was her responsibility to give it a voice. The email landed in Sarah Miller's inbox late on a Tuesday night as she was preparing for a court appearance the next day. She received dozens of emails a day, but the subject line, "Regarding Kevin Miller 2011, made her freeze. She opened it, her professional composure dissolving as she read Chloe's cautious words. For 14 years, she had waited for a crack in the silence, and now it had appeared in the sterile glow of her computer screen. She immediately picked up the phone and called the number, her voice shaking for the first time in years. The conversation that followed was tense and surreal. Chloe, wary and scared, described the scrapbook in halting detail, her voice cracking as she recounted the images on its pages. Sarah listened, her mind racing, a storm of emotions, disbelief, hope, rage, and a profound, bone-deep validation washing over her. The story Chloe told confirmed the doubt she had harbored for half her life. There was evidence. There was proof. Someone else was in that basement with Kevin. The next morning, Sarah was on a plane back to Oregon. She contacted a trusted former professor from law school who had connections within the state's Department of Justice, bypassing the local Lake Oswego Police Department she no longer trusted. She explained the situation, her voice calm and measured, the lawyer in her taking control. Within hours of her landing in Portland, a meeting was arranged with a senior detective from the state's cold case unit, a woman named Isabella Rossi. Sarah and Chloe met with Detective Rossi in a sterile conference room, the black scrapbook lying on the table between them like an unexploded bomb ready to shatter a 14-year-old lie. Detective Isabella Rossi was a new breed of investigator, a sharp, tech-savvy detective in her late 30s who viewed cold cases not as historical artifacts, but as complex puzzles waiting for the right key. She approached the black scrapbook with a reverent caution, her gloved hands turning its stiff pages under the bright, unforgiving lights of the Oregon State Police Forensics Lab. She listened intently as Sarah Miller, now a poised and formidable lawyer, recounted the history of her brother's case and the family's long-held dismissed doubts. Rossi understood immediately that the scrapbook was more than just a macabre artifact. It was a primary source, a direct, unfiltered view into a moment that had been critically misinterpreted. The first step was to analyze the photographs themselves. They were not digital images, but physical Polaroid-style prints, a medium that was already becoming nostalgic in 2011. This physicality was a boon for forensic analysis. Rossi brought the images to the lab's lead forensic photography analyst, a man named Dr. Alistair Finch, whose specialty was extracting hidden data from analog sources. Finch's lab was a quiet, sterile space filled with high-powered microscopes, spectral imaging systems, and custom software designed to digitize and deconstruct physical photographs at a near-molecular level. Dr. Finch began by creating high-resolution digital scans of each photograph, capturing far more detail than the naked eye could ever perceive. His initial examination focused on the lighting. The only light source in the original police photos was the single, bare bulb in the center of the basement. However, in several of the scrapbook's photos, particularly those taken from a lower angle, Dr. Finch's software detected a secondary, inconsistent light source, a faint, diffused glow emanating from near the floor in the corner of the room. It was the distinct, cool light of a small electronic screen, like that of a digital camera or a flip phone, used to illuminate the scene for a better shot. This discovery was the first crack in the official narrative. The presence of a second light source, one that was not documented in the original police report, was a clear indication of staging. Someone had been carefully composing these shots, using an additional light to capture the gruesome tableau they had created. This was not the impulsive act of a desperate child. It was the deliberate, methodical work of a voyeur, a documentarian of death. Detective Rossi felt a chill. The case was already transforming before her eyes, shifting from a tragedy of despair to a crime of profound cruelty. The next breakthrough came from an analysis of shadows. In one photograph, taken from across the room, Kevin's suspended body cast a sharp, distinct shadow on the concrete wall behind him, a shadow consistent with the overhead light bulb. But Dr. Finch's analysis revealed something else, a second, fainter shadow superimposed almost perfectly over the first. It was the faint outline of another person, a silhouette of a head and shoulders, cast from a position just to the side of the person taking the picture. It was a ghost in the machine, an undeniable specter of a second individual present in the room, someone who had been standing just out of frame. The evidence was now irrefutable. At least 2 other people were in the basement with Kevin Miller that day. One person was taking the pictures, their presence betrayed by the light from their camera screen, and a second person was standing nearby, their presence betrayed by their shadow. The suicide theory, which rested entirely on the premise that Kevin was alone, was not just challenged, it was obliterated. Detective Rossi now had the scientific proof she needed to officially reopen the case, transforming a 14-year-old closed file into an active homicide investigation. But the most damning discovery was yet to come. Dr. Finch turned his attention to a close-up photo of Kevin's hands. In the original autopsy report, his hands were noted as being free of defensive wounds. This new, clearer photograph, however, told a different story. Under extreme magnification, Dr. Finch isolated a series of faint, reddish marks and deep indentations on Kevin's palms and wrists. He cross-referenced the patterns with a forensic database. The marks were not random scrapes. They were consistent with rope burns and pressure marks from having one's hands forcibly held or bound together just prior to death. Furthermore, a tiny dark fiber was visible, snagged on Kevin's thumbnail. It was almost microscopic, something the original medical examiner, looking for major trauma, would have easily missed. The fiber was carefully extracted from the photograph's high-resolution scan and analyzed for its properties. It did not match the fibers of the main ligature rope or any of the clothing Kevin was wearing. It was a foreign material, evidence of contact with another object or person. These were not the hands of someone who had willingly participated in their own death. They were the hands of someone who had struggled against their captors. The scientific evidence painted a horrifying new picture of Kevin Miller's final moments. He had not been alone. He had been held, his hands likely bound, and he had fought for his life. The scene had then been meticulously staged to look like a suicide, and the perpetrators had documented their work with a camera, keeping the photographs as a secret trophy. The scrapbook was not just a chronicle of a secret. It was a taunt, a boast from a killer who had believed they had committed the perfect crime. Detective Rossi presented the findings to her superiors and to the district attorney's office. The new evidence was overwhelming and incontrovertible. The original suicide ruling was officially overturned, and a public announcement was made the case of Kevin Miller was now being investigated as a homicide. The news sent a shockwave through the quiet community of Lake Oswego, dredging up a past that many had considered long buried and settled. For Sarah Miller, the moment was one of profound, painful vindication. For 14 years, she had carried the certainty of her brother's murder in her heart, a truth that no one else would believe. Now science had finally caught up to her intuition. The scuffed shoes, the missing note, the memory of her brother's distress, it all clicked into place, pieces of a puzzle that finally had a frame. The grief was still there, a raw and open wound, but it was now mixed with a new, powerful emotion, a cold, righteous anger, and a determination to see the investigation through to its end. The ghost of her brother had finally been heard, and the hunt for his killer had officially begun. With the official reclassification of Kevin Miller's death as a homicide, Detective Isabella Rossi launched a full-scale investigation, starting from scratch. The 14-year-old file was a roadmap of missed opportunities and flawed assumptions, but the scrapbook was their Rosetta Stone, a key to deciphering the past. Rossi's primary, immediate objective was simple and direct: identify the owner of the scrapbook. Every page, every photo, every scrawled caption was a clue pointing back to a 12-year-old boy who, in 2011, was a classmate of Kevin Miller. Rossi assembled a small, dedicated team. They began by obtaining Kevin's 7th grade class list from the Lake Oswego School District archives, a simple roster of names that was now their primary pool of suspects. Alongside the names were the school photos from that year, a gallery of smiling, awkward preteens, any one of whom could have grown up to be a killer hiding in plain sight. The team's first task was to build a digital and physical profile for every single student on that list, tracing their lives from middle school to the present day. The investigation was a painstaking process of 21st-century archaeology. Detectives scoured social media, public records, and LexisNexis databases, piecing together the last 14 years of nearly 100 individuals. They were looking for connections, for red flags, for any link to the name Chloe had given them: Mark Bishop. According to the old-school records, Mark had been one of Kevin's classmates, and according to a few cursory interviews from the original file, one of his friends. He was now a prime suspect. While one part of the team focused on tracking down the former students, another worked on analyzing the scrapbook for more clues. The handwriting in the book was analyzed by a forensic document examiner. The expert determined the scrawled captions were written by a single individual, likely a male, who was trying to disguise his natural script, but certain telltale characteristics, the loop of a gank, the cross of a cravat, a baseline for future comparison. The scrapbook itself, a generic brand from a craft store, offered no fingerprints, wiped clean by time or intention. The first round of interviews began, starting with former students who had moved away from Oregon, whom detectives could speak to without alerting the local community. The conversations were surreal. Most of these now 30-somethings had only vague, faded memories of middle school and of Kevin Miller. They remembered him as the quiet kid who died, the suicide story so deeply ingrained that the news of a homicide investigation was met with stunned disbelief. Rossi's team carefully guided the conversations, asking not just about Kevin, but about his social circle, specifically about his friendship with Mark Bishop. Slowly, a picture began to emerge. Kevin, Mark, and a few other boys had been part of a tight-knit group. They were known for being obsessed with video games and for making short, amateur action movies with a home video camera. One former classmate recalled that Mark Bishop was the group's charismatic but often cruel leader. He was the one who came up with their games, which sometimes veered into dares and reckless stunts. This small detail was a significant development. It established a group dynamic, a possible context for the events in the basement. Detective Rossi located Mark Bishop's current address in Arizona, where he lived with his family in a pristine suburban home. She made the strategic decision not to approach him yet. Confronting the primary suspect too early could cause him to lawyer up, or worse, to contact other potential co-conspirators and coordinate their stories. The pact of silence, if one existed, had held for 14 years. Rossi needed more leverage before she could hope to break it. Her strategy was to build a case around the edges first, to isolate Mark by speaking to the other members of his childhood clique. The investigation narrowed its focus to 3 other names that came up repeatedly in connection with Mark and Kevin: a man named Liam, now a high school teacher in Seattle; another named Chris, a mechanic living in eastern Oregon, and a third, David, who still lived in Lake Oswego, working for his family's construction business. These 4 boys, Mark, Liam, Chris, and David, had been inseparable in middle school. The team hypothesized that if others were involved, they were the most likely candidates. Rossi decided to approach them simultaneously to prevent them from communicating. She flew to Seattle herself to interview Liam, the teacher, while other detectives were dispatched to speak with Chris and David. The interviews were designed to be non-confrontational at first, framed as a routine follow-up on a newly reopened cold case. They asked about his memories of Kevin, about the friend group, about the kinds of things they used to do for fun. Liam was nervous and fidgety, his answers clipped and evasive. He claimed he barely remembered that time of his life, a clear lie that set Rossi's instincts on high alert. In eastern Oregon, the detective interviewing Chris, the mechanic, encountered a more hostile reaction. Chris became defensive almost immediately, demanding to know why police were digging up the past and angrily denying he knew anything. In Lake Oswego, David, the construction worker, had the most visceral reaction. When shown a photo of his younger self with Kevin and Mark, he grew pale and claimed he felt ill, abruptly ending the interview. The coordinated, fearful reactions of the 3 men were a silent confession. They were all hiding the same secret. Rossi now had what she needed. The 3 interviews, while yielding no direct confessions, established a clear pattern of shared deception. She had confirmed the existence of a pact of silence. The scrapbook was the key, and its ownership almost certainly traced back to Mark Bishop, the group's leader. The new investigation had successfully peeled back the first layer of the 14-year-old lie, revealing a conspiracy of silence among a group of childhood friends. The next step was to find out what terrible secret they were protecting. The synchronized, fearful reactions from Liam, Chris, and David provided Detective Rossi with the leverage she needed. It was clear they were all complicit in a cover-up, their shared terror, a beacon signaling a dark, buried secret. Rossi's strategy pivoted from information gathering to psychological pressure. She knew that a pact of silence held together by childhood fear was inherently unstable, and all it needed was the right crack for the entire structure to collapse. The weakest point, she wagered, was not the defiant leader, but one of the followers who had been living with the guilt for 14 years. Rossi decided to re-interview Liam, the high school teacher in Seattle. She chose him for a reason. His profession suggested a man who valued order, morality, and the well-being of children, qualities that were in direct conflict with the secret he was keeping. She approached him again, not at his home, but at a neutral location, bringing with her a single, powerful tool, a high-quality reproduction of one of the scrapbook photos, the one showing the faint, ghostly shadow on the basement wall. This time, Rossi's demeanor was different. It was not inquisitive, but certain. She placed the photograph on the table in front of Liam and said nothing, letting the silence stretch and fill the room. Liam stared at the image, his composure crumbling in real time. He saw the shadow, he saw the scene, and he knew with sickening certainty that the police had more than just questions. His carefully constructed life, his career, his reputation was about to be annihilated by a ghost from his past. After a long, tense silence, Liam finally broke. The story that came pouring out was not one of a premeditated malicious murder, but a story of a childhood game that had spiraled into a horrific, unimaginable tragedy. This was the second stunning twist in the case. Kevin Miller's death was not a suicide, but it wasn't a cold-blooded homicide either. It was an accident, a terrible, unforgivable accident, born from the unique cruelty and recklessness of 12-year-old boys. Liam recounted that their friend group, led by the charismatic and domineering Mark Bishop, had become obsessed with dares. Mark had invented a game they called the Ghost, a twisted version of chicken. The challenge was to simulate a hanging to see who could withstand the pressure of a noose for the longest before being let down by the others. It was a stupid, dangerous game, fueled by a misguided sense of adolescent bravado and a complete lack of understanding of its true lethality. On that October afternoon in 2011, the boys had gathered at Kevin's house after school, his parents not due home for hours. It was Kevin's turn to play the Ghost. Liam explained that Kevin hadn't wanted to do it, he had been scared, trying to back out, which explained the argument his parents had overheard earlier that week. But Mark, ever the ringleader, had goaded him, calling him a coward, using the powerful social leverage of a middle schooler to pressure him into compliance. The other boys, including Liam, had gone along with it, too afraid of Mark to stand up for their friend. In the basement, they set up the scene. According to Liam's tearful confession, the plan was for Chris and David to hold the rope, ready to release it, while Mark documented the dare with his Polaroid camera, the Scrapbook, a pre-planned vessel for their secret club's exploits. But something went catastrophically wrong. In their clumsy, childish haste, the rope slipped or was tied incorrectly. Kevin lost consciousness almost instantly, his struggle brief and silent. The scuff on his shoe came not from being dragged, but from his foot kicking out and hitting a wooden crate in the initial convulsive moments. Panic erupted. The boys, faced with the limp, lifeless body of their friend, were plunged into a state of pure, unadulterated terror. They were just children, and they had just killed their friend. Mark Bishop, his bravado instantly evaporating and replaced by a cold, calculating fear, took control. He insisted that no one would ever believe it was an accident. They would be sent to prison. Their lives would be over. The only way out, he argued, was to make it look like a suicide. In a state of shock and fear, the other boys followed his lead. They adjusted the scene, removed any trace of their presence, and fled the house, leaving Kevin behind. They swore an oath of absolute silence, a pact forged in shared trauma and guilt, a secret they promised to take to their graves. Mark kept the scrapbook, a chilling collection of trophies from the game, its final pages becoming the record of the day their childhood ended. He held onto it not just as a memento, but as a piece of insurance, a way to ensure the others would never talk, as its existence implicated them all. Liam's confession provided the complete context for the crime. It explained the forensic evidence, the presence of others, the staging of the scene, the lack of a major struggle, and the subtle marks on Kevin's hands from where they had clumsily handled him. It also explained the motive behind the cover-up, not malice, but the desperate, terrified panic of children. The dots were now connected, revealing a picture that was, in many ways, more tragic and disturbing than a simple story of good versus evil. It was a story of how easily adolescent cruelty, peer pressure, and a moment of profound stupidity could lead to an irreversible tragedy. Armed with Liam's confession, Detective Rossi finally had everything she needed to confront the man who had orchestrated it all, Mark Bishop. The final act of the investigation took place under the relentless sun of Arizona. Detective Rossi, accompanied by a local detective, drove through the manicured streets of Mark Bishop's suburban neighborhood, a place of beige stucco houses and immaculate green lawns that stood in stark contrast to the dark, damp secret of the Lake Oswego basement. Mark, now a successful architect and family man, had built a life that was a monument to normalcy, a carefully constructed facade designed to bury the terrified 12-year-old boy he had once been. Rossi had a warrant for his arrest, but she didn't lead with it. Her approach was psychological. She knew that a direct accusation would be met with a wall of denial and a call to a lawyer. Instead, she wanted to peel back the layers of Mark's carefully crafted adult life and speak directly to the frightened child still hiding inside. They found him in his home office, a bright, airy room with blueprints spread across a large desk, the picture of professional success. He was initially calm, almost dismissive, when Rossi introduced herself. He feigned a lack of memory when she brought up Lake Oswego and Kevin Miller, a well-rehearsed performance he had likely been perfecting for 14 years. He expressed surprise and mild concern when she informed him the case had been reopened as a homicide, playing the part of an uninvolved old acquaintance. Rossi let him talk, letting him build his wall of lies, knowing that she possessed the one thing that could tear it all down. When he was finished with his performance, Rossi said nothing. She simply opened a briefcase and placed 2 items on his pristine desk. The first was a printed copy of Liam's signed confession, its detailed account of the game and the subsequent cover-up lying face up. The second was the original scrapbook, its black cover and cryptic title, A Ghost from a Past He Thought He Had Escaped. The shift in Mark was instantaneous and seismic. The color drained from his face. The confident architect vanished, and in his place was a man staring at his own damnation. He stared at the scrapbook, his hands trembling slightly. He hadn't seen it in over a decade, having abandoned it in the storage unit during a messy breakup, a careless mistake that had now undone him. Rossi's voice was quiet, clinical, as she walked him through the evidence. She described the forensic analysis of the photos, the secondary light source, the shadow on the wall. Then she recounted Liam's confession, her words a hammer striking the foundations of his denial. Mark's composure shattered. His first reaction was not remorse but anger, a desperate lashing out at his former friend. Liam talked, he stammered, his voice a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. He promised. We all promised. In that moment, he was no longer a 30-year-old man, he was the 12-year-old ringleader, furious that his pact had been broken, that his control had been lost. His outrage was an inadvertent confession, an admission of the conspiracy's existence. Rossi pressed her advantage, her tone softening slightly, becoming almost maternal. She spoke of the terror those boys must have felt in that basement, the panic that led them to make a terrible decision. She was offering him a way to reframe the narrative, not as a cold-blooded killer, but as a scared kid who made a mistake, and then spent a lifetime trying to outrun it. It was a classic interrogation technique, offering a path of lesser resistance, a way for the suspect to confess without having to admit to being a monster. The weight of 14 years of silence, of guilt, of a secret that had festered in the dark, finally became too much to bear. Mark Bishop slumped in his expensive office chair, the facade of his adult life completely disintegrated. He began to cry, not the quiet sobs of a remorseful man, but the racking, gasping cries of a child. And then he began to talk. His confession mirrored Liam's, but was filled with the chilling details of a leader. He recounted the thrill of the dare, the power he felt in goading Kevin, and the wave of absolute, world-ending panic when he realized Kevin was dead. He admitted that the idea to stage the suicide was his, a cold, pragmatic decision made in a split second to save himself. He described how he directed the other terrified boys, telling them what to do, what to say, and how to act. He was the architect of the cover-up, just as he was now an architect of buildings. He confessed that he kept the scrapbook as a form of control, a dark trophy that also served as blackmail. As long as he had the photos, he knew the others would never dare to speak out, as the images implicated them all in the act of being present. He never looked at it, he claimed, but knowing it existed was a source of a strange, perverse security. For 14 years, he had lived with the knowledge that his entire life was built on a lie, a foundation of rotted wood, and he had been waiting every single day for it to collapse. As he finished his confession, a strange calm settled over him, the calm of acceptance. The fight was over. The secret was out. Detective Rossi read him his rights, her voice gentle but firm. The sounds of the handcuffs clicking into place echoed in the bright, sunny room, a final, definitive end to a 14-year-long charade. The confrontation was over, the confession secured, and the truth of what happened in the Miller family's basement was finally, painfully, brought into the light. The arrest of Mark Bishop and the subsequent implication of Liam, Chris, and David sent a new shockwave through the community, one that replaced the mystery of a cold case with the complex and sordid reality of the truth. The legal resolution was not as straightforward as a typical homicide trial. Given the suspects' ages at the time of the crime and the nature of the event as a reckless act turned fatal, the district attorney pursued charges of manslaughter and conspiracy to conceal a death rather than first-degree murder. Liam and the other two members of the friend group, faced with Liam's confession and the evidence from the scrapbook, accepted plea bargains in exchange for their testimony against Mark Bishop. Their cooperation painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture for the court of how peer pressure and childish bravado had led to an accidental death and how fear had led to a criminal cover-up. They were sentenced to probation and community service, their lives forever marred by the secret they had kept since they were 12 years old. Mark Bishop, as the ringleader and the architect of the deception, faced a more severe penalty. His trial was a media sensation, a somber courtroom drama that dissected the very nature of adolescent culpability and long-term guilt. The scrapbook, with its chilling photos, was entered as Exhibit A, its pages a silent, damning testament to the crime. Mark was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to a significant prison term, the successful life he had built for himself dismantled by the consequences of a single, terrible afternoon from his youth. For the public, the resolution was a source of endless debate, a tragic story with no true villains, only victims of varying degrees, a boy who lost his life and other boys who lost their innocence and their futures. But for the Miller family, the legal outcome was secondary. The trial, the sentencing, the headlines, it was all just noise. Their focus was on the one thing they had been denied for 14 years, the truth. The aftermath for them was not about celebration or even relief, but about a profound and painful recalibration of their grief. They finally had the answer to the question that had haunted them, but the answer itself was a new source of pain. Their son had not been secretly depressed or suicidal. He had been scared, bullied by his friends, and a victim of their unbelievable recklessness. He had died not because he wanted to, but because he was too afraid to say no to a dare. This knowledge was both a vindication and an agony. Sarah Miller sat in the courtroom every single day of the trial, a stoic, unwavering presence. She listened to the testimony, her face an unreadable mask, as the last moments of her brother's life were laid bare for the world to see. She had spent half her life fighting for this moment, driven by a righteous anger and a need for justice. But now that it was here, she found that justice was a far more complicated concept than she had imagined. It did not bring her brother back. It did not erase the 14 years her family had spent living under the shadow of a lie. After the final verdict was read, Sarah and her parents returned to the family home in Lake Oswego. That evening, for the first time in over a decade, they opened the door to Kevin's room. The air was still and thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a perfect time capsule of a 12-year-old boy's life from 2011. His comic books were still stacked on his desk, his posters still taped to the wall, his life exactly as he had left it. Sarah walked over to her closet and retrieved the box containing the scuffed sneakers and the unfinished comic book. She held the shoes in her hands, the dark mark on their side no longer a symbol of a nagging doubt, but a confirmed piece of a tragic story. She then picked up the comic book, looking at the final, unfinished panel where the hero stood cornered by a shadowy villain. For so long, she had seen it as a story that needed an ending, a battle that she needed to win on his behalf. But now, she understood that her job was not to finish his story, but to allow it to be what it was, the vibrant, creative, and unfinished story of a boy who loved to draw and explore, a boy who was loved. The legal system had provided a resolution, but the family's healing would come from their own private act of justice, the act of correctly remembering their son. They could finally grieve the real Kevin, not the tragic phantom created by a flawed investigation, and in that corrected memory, they could finally find a measure of peace. The case was closed, the silence was broken, and the truth, in all its painful complexity, had finally set them free.